The wind howled. Lightning stabbed at the earth erratically, like an inefficient assassin. Thunder rolled back and forth across the dark, rain-lashed hills. The night was as black as the inside of a cat. It was the kind of night you could believe, on which gods moved men as though they were pawns on the chessboard of fate. In the middle of this elemental storm, a fire gleamed among the dripping furze bushes like the madness in a weasel's eye. It illuminated 3 hunched figures. As the cauldron bubbled, an eldritch voice shrieked, "When shall we 3 meet again?" There was a pause. Finally, another voice said, in far more ordinary tones, "Well, I can do next Tuesday." Through the fathomless deeps of space swims the star-turtle Great Atuin, bearing on its back the 4 giant elephants who carry on their shoulders the mass of the Discworld. A tiny sun and moon spin around them on a complicated orbit to induce seasons, so probably nowhere else in the multiverse is it sometimes necessary for an elephant to cock a leg to allow the sun to go past. Exactly why this should be may never be known. Possibly the creator of the universe got bored with all the usual business of axial inclination, albedos and rotational velocities, and decided to have a bit of fun for once. It would be a pretty good bet that the gods of a world like this probably do not play chess, and, indeed, this is the case. In fact, no gods anywhere play chess. They haven't got the imagination. Gods prefer simple, vicious games where you do not achieve transcendence but go straight to oblivion. The key to the understanding of all religion is that a god's idea of amusement is snakes and ladders with greased rungs. Magic glues the Discworld together. Magic generated by the turning of the world itself. Magic wound like silk out of the underlying structure of existence to suture the wounds of reality. A lot of it ends up in the Ramtop Mountains, which stretch from the frozen lands near the hub all the way via a lengthy archipelago to the warm seas which flow endlessly into space over the rim. Raw magic crackles invisibly from peak to peak and earths itself in the mountains. It is the Ramtops that supply the world with most of its witches and wizards. In the Ramtops, the leaves on the trees move even when there is no breeze. Rocks go for a stroll of an evening. Even the land, at times, seems alive. At times, so does the sky. The storm was really giving it everything it had. This was its big chance. It had spent years hanging around the provinces, putting in some useful work as a squall, building up experience, making contacts, occasionally leaping out on unsuspecting shepherds or blasting quite small oak trees. Now, an opening in the weather had given it an opportunity to strut its hour, and it was building up its role in the hope of being spotted by one of the big climates. It was a good storm. There was quite effective projection and passion there, and critics agreed that if it would only learn to control its thunder, it would be, in years to come, a storm to watch. The woods roared their applause and were full of mists and flying leaves. On nights such as these, the gods, as has already been pointed out, play games other than chess with the fates of mortals and the thrones of kings. It is important to remember that they always cheat, right up to the end. And a coach came hurtling along the rough forest track, jerking violently as the wheels bounced off tree roots. The driver lashed at the team, the desperate crack of his whip providing a rather neat counterpoint to the crash of the tempest overhead. Behind, only a little way behind and getting closer, were 3 hooded riders. On nights such as this, evil deeds are done. And good deeds, of course, but mostly evil on the whole. On nights such as this, witches are abroad. Well, not actually abroad. They don't like the food and you can't trust the water, and the shamans always hog the deck chairs. But there was a full moon breasting the ragged clouds, and the rushing air was full of whispers and a very broad hint of magic. In their clearing above the forest, the witches spoke thus. "I'm babysitting on Tuesday," said the one with no hat but a thatch of white curls so thick she might have been wearing a helmet. "For our Jason's youngest. I can manage Friday. Hurry up with the tea, love. I'm that parched." The junior member of the trio gave a sigh and ladled some boiling water out of the cauldron into the teapot. The third witch patted her hand in a kindly fashion. "You said it quite well," she said. "Just a bit more work on the screeching. Ain't that right, Nanny Og?" "Very useful screeching, I thought," said Nanny Og hurriedly. "And I can see Goody Wemper, may she rest in peace, gave you a lot of help with the squint." "It's a good squint," said Granny Weatherwax. The junior witch, whose name was Margaret Garlick, relaxed considerably. She held Granny Weatherwax in awe. It was known throughout the Ramtop Mountains that Mistress Weatherwax did not approve of anything very much. If she said it was a good squint, then Margaret's eyes were probably staring up her own nostrils. Unlike wizards, who like nothing better than a complicated hierarchy, witches don't go in much for the structured approach to career progression. It's up to each individual witch to take on a girl to hand the area over to when she dies. Witches are not by nature gregarious, at least with other witches, and they certainly don't have leaders. Granny Weatherwax was the most highly regarded of the leaders they didn't have. Margaret's hands shook slightly as they made the tea. Of course, it was all very gratifying, but it was a bit nerve-wracking to start one's working life as village witch between Granny and, on the other side of the forest, Nanny Og. It had been her idea to form a local coven. She felt it was more, well, occult. To her amazement, the other two had agreed, or at least hadn't disagreed much. "An oven?" Nanny Og had said. "What do we want to join an oven for?" "She means a coven, Gither," Granny Weatherwax had explained. "You know, like in the old days, a meeting." "An ease up," said Nanny Og hopefully. "No dancing," Granny had warned. "I don't hold with dancing, or singing, or getting overexcited, or all that messing about with ointments and similar." "Does you good to get out," said Nanny happily. Margaret had been disappointed about the dancing, and was relieved that she hadn't ventured one or two other ideas that had been on her mind. She fumbled in the packet she had brought with her. It was her first Sabbat, and she was determined to do it right. "Would anyone care for a scone?" she said. Granny looked hard at hers before she bit. Margaret had baked bat designs on it. They had little eyes made of currants. The coach crashed through the trees at the forest edge, ran on two wheels for a few seconds as it hit a stone, righted itself against all the laws of balance, and rumbled on. But it was going slower now. The slope was dragging at it. The coachman, standing upright in the manner of a charioteer, pushed his hair out of his eyes and peered through the murk. No one lived up here, in the lap of the Ramtops themselves, but there was a light ahead. By all that was merciful, there was a light there. An arrow buried itself in the coach roof behind him. Meanwhile, King Verence, monarch of Lanka, was making a discovery. Like most people at any rate below the age of 60 or so, Verence hadn't exercised his mind much about what happened to you when you died. Like most people since the dawn of time, he assumed it all somehow worked out all right in the end. And, like most people since the dawn of time, he was now dead. He was, in fact, lying at the bottom of one of his own stairways in Lanka Castle with a dagger in his back. He sat up, and was surprised to find that while someone he was certainly inclined to think of as himself was sitting up, something very much like his body remained lying on the floor. It was a pretty good body, incidentally, now he came to see it from outside for the first time. He had always been quite attached to it, although, he had to admit, this did not now seem to be the case. It was big and well-muscled. He'd looked after it. He'd allowed it a moustache and long flowing locks. He'd seen it got plenty of healthy outdoor exercise and lots of red meat. Now, just when a body would have been useful, it had let him down. Or out. On top of that, he had to come to terms with the tall, thin figure standing beside him. Most of it was hidden in a hooded black robe, but the one arm which extended from the folds to grip a large scythe was made of bone. When one is dead, there are things one instinctively recognizes.
Hello.
Verence drew himself up to his full height, or what would have been his full height if that part of him to which the word height could have been applied was not lying stiff on the floor and facing a future in which only the word depth could be appropriate. "I am a king, mark you," he said.
Was, Your Majesty.
"What?" Verence barked.
I said was. It's called the past tense. You'll soon get used to it.
The tall figure tapped its calcareous fingers on the scythe's handle. It was obviously upset about something. If it came to that, Verence thought, so am I. But the various broad hints available in his present circumstances were breaking through even the mad brain stupidity that made up most of his character, and it was dawning on him that whatever kingdom he might currently be in, he wasn't king of it. "Are you Death, fellow?" he ventured.
I have many names.
"Which one are you using at present?" said Verence with a shade more deference. There were people milling around them. In fact, quite a few people were milling through them, like ghosts. "Oh, so it was Felmet," the king added vaguely, looking at the figure lurking with obscene delight at the top of the stairs. "My father said I should never let him get behind me. Why don't I feel angry?"
Glands,
said Death shortly.
adrenaline and so forth. And emotions, you don't have them. All you have now is thought.
The tall figure appeared to reach a decision.
This is very irregular.
He went on, apparently to himself.
However, who am I to argue?
Who indeed?
What?
I said, who indeed?
Shut up.
Death stood with his skull on one side as though listening to some inner voice. As his hood fell away, the late king noticed that Death resembled a polished skeleton in every way but one. His eye sockets glowed sky blue. Verence wasn't frightened, however, not simply because it is difficult to be in fear of anything when the bits you need to be frightened with are curdling several yards away, but because he had never really been frightened of anything in his life, and wasn't going to start now. This was partly because he didn't have the imagination, but he was also one of those rare individuals who are totally focused in time. Most people aren't. They live their lives as a sort of temporal blur around the point where their body actually is, anticipating the future or holding on to the past. They're usually so busy thinking about what happens next that the only time they ever find out what is happening now is when they come to look back on it. Most people are like this. They learn how to fear because they can actually tell, down at the subconscious level, what is going to happen next. It's already happening to them. But Verence had always lived only for the present. Until now, anyway. Death sighed.
I suppose no one mentioned anything to you?
He hazarded. Say again?
No premonitions, strange dreams, mad old soothsayers shouting things at you in the street?
About what? Dying?
No, I suppose not. It would be too much to expect,
said Death sourly.
They leave it all to me.
Who do? Said Verence, mystified.
Fate, destiny, all the rest of them.
Death laid a hand on the king's shoulder.
The fact is, I'm afraid, you're due to become a ghost.
Oh. He looked down at his body, which seemed solid enough. Then someone walked through him.
Don't let it upset you.
Verence watched his own stiff corpse being carried reverentially from the hall. "I'll try," he said.
Good man.
"I don't think I will be up to all that business with the white sheets and the chains, though," he said. "Do I have to walk around moaning and screaming?" Death shrugged.
Do you want to?
He said. "No."
Then I shouldn't bother if I were you.
Death pulled an hourglass from the recesses of his dark robe and inspected it closely.
And now I really must be going,
he said. He turned on his heel, put his scythe over his shoulder, and started to walk out of the hall through the wall. "I say, just hold on there," shouted Verence, running after him. Death didn't look back. Verence followed him through the wall. It was like walking through fog. "Is that all?" he demanded. "I mean, how long will I be a ghost? Why am I a ghost? You can't just leave me like this." He halted and raised an imperious, slightly transparent finger. "Stop! I command you!" Death shook his head gloomily and stepped through the next wall. The king hurried after him with as much dignity as he could still muster, and found Death fiddling with the girths of a large white horse standing on the battlements. It was wearing a nosebag. "You can't leave me like this," he repeated in the face of the evidence. Death turned to him.
I can,
he said.
You're undead, you see. Ghosts inhabit a world between the living and the dead. It's not my responsibility.
He patted the king on the shoulder.
Don't worry,
he said.
It won't be forever.
Good.
It may seem like forever.
How long will it really be?
Until you have fulfilled your destiny, I assume.
And how will I know what my destiny is? Said the king desperately.
Can't help there. I'm sorry.
Well, how can I find out?
These things generally become apparent, I understand,
said Death, and swung himself into the saddle. And until then I have to haunt this place? King Verence stared around at the draughty battlements. All alone, I suppose. Won't anyone be able to see me?
Oh, the psychically inclined, close relatives, and cats, of course.
I hate cats. Death's face became a little stiffer, if that were possible. The blue glow in his eye sockets flickered red for an instant.
I see,
he said. The tone suggested that Death was too good for cat haters.
You like great big dogs, I imagine.
As a matter of fact, I do. The king stared gloomily at the dawn. His dogs. He'd really miss his dogs. And it looked like such a good hunting day. He wondered if ghosts hunted. Almost certainly not, he imagined. Or ate. Or drank either, for that matter, and that was really depressing. He liked a big, noisy banquet, and had quaffed many a pint of good ale. And bad ale, come to that.
Quaffing is like drinking, but you spill more.
He'd never been able to tell the difference till the morning after, usually. He kicked despondently at a stone, and noted gloomily that his foot went right through it. No hunting, drinking, carousing, no wassailing, no hawking. It was dawning on him that the pleasures of the flesh were pretty sparse without the flesh. Suddenly life wasn't worth living. The fact that he wasn't living it didn't cheer him up at all.
Some people like to be ghosts,
said Death. Said Verence gloomily.
It's not such a wrench, I assume. They can see how their descendants get on. Sorry, is something the matter?
But Verence had vanished into the wall.
Don't mind me, will you?
Said Death peevishly. He looked around him with a gaze that could see through time and space and the souls of men, and noted a landslide in distant Clatch, a hurricane in Hawonderland, a plague in Hergen.
Busy, busy,
he muttered, and spurred his horse into the sky. Verence ran through the walls of his own castle. His feet barely touched the ground. In fact, the unevenness of the floor meant that at times they didn't touch the ground at all. As a king, he was used to treating servants as if they were not there, and running through them as a ghost was almost the same. The only difference was that they didn't stand aside. Verence reached the nursery, saw the broken door, the trailed sheets. Heard the hoofbeats. He reached the window, saw his own horse go full tilt through the open gateway in the shafts of the coach. A few seconds later, 3 horsemen followed it. The sound of hooves echoed for a moment on the cobbles and died away. The king thumped the sill, his fist going several inches into the stone. Then he pushed his way out into the air, disdaining to notice the drop, and half flew, half ran down across the courtyard and into the stables. It took him a mere 20 seconds to learn that to the great many things a ghost cannot do should be added the mounting of a horse. He did succeed in getting into the saddle, or at least straddling the air just above it. But when the horse finally bolted, terrified beyond belief by the mysterious things happening behind its ears, Verence was left sitting astride 5 feet of fresh air. He tried to run, and got about as far as the gateway before the air around him thickened to the consistency of tar. "You can't," said a sad old voice behind him. "You have to stay where you were killed. That's what haunting means. Take it from me, I know." Granny Weatherwax paused with a second scone halfway to her mouth. "Something comes," she said. "Can you tell by the pricking of your thumbs?" said Margaret earnestly. Margaret had learned a lot about witchcraft from books. "The pricking of my ears," said Granny. She raised her eyebrows at Nanny Og. Old Goody Wemper had been an excellent witch in her way, but far too fanciful. Too many flowers and romantic notions and such. The occasional flash of lightning showed the moorland stretching down to the forest, but the rain on the warm summer earth had filled the air with mist wraiths. "Hoofbeats," said Nanny Og. "No one would come up here this time of night." Margaret peered around timidly. Here and there on the moor were huge standing stones, their origins lost in time, which was said to lead mobile and private lives of their own. She shivered. "What's to be afraid of?" she managed. "Us," said Granny Weatherwax smugly. The hoofbeats neared, slowed, and then the coach rattled between the furze bushes, its horses hanging in their harnesses. The driver leapt down, ran around to the door, pulled a large bundle from inside, and dashed towards the trio. He was halfway across the damp peat when he stopped and stared at Granny Weatherwax with a look of horror. "It's all right," she whispered, and the whisper cut through the grumbling of the storm as clearly as a bell. She took a few steps forward, and a convenient lightning flash allowed her to look directly into the man's eyes. They had the peculiarity of focus that told those who had the know that he was no longer looking at anything in this world. With a final jerking movement, he thrust the bundle into Granny's arms and toppled forward, the feathers of a crossbow bolt sticking out of his back. 3 figures moved into the firelight. Granny looked up into another pair of eyes, which were as chilly as the slopes of hell. Their owner threw his crossbow aside. There was a glimpse of chainmail under his sodden cloak as he drew his sword. He didn't flourish it. The eyes that didn't leave Granny's face weren't the eyes of one who bothers about flourishing things. They were the eyes of one who knows exactly what swords are for. He reached out his hand. "You will give it to me," he said. Granny twitched aside the blanket in her arms and looked down at a small face wrapped in sleep. She looked up. "No," she said, on general principles. The soldier glanced from her to Margaret and Nanny Og, who were as still as the standing stones of the moor. "You are witches?" he said. Granny nodded. Lightning skewered down from the sky, and a bush 100 yards away blossomed into fire. The 2 soldiers behind the man muttered something, but he smiled and raised a mailed hand. "Does the skin of witches turn aside steel?" he said. "Not that I'm aware," said Granny levelly. "You could give it a try." One of the soldiers stepped forward and touched the man's arm gingerly. "Sir, with respect, sir, it's not a good idea." "Be silent." "But it's terrible bad luck to—" "Must I ask you again?" "Sir," said the man. His eyes caught Granny's for a moment and reflected hopeless terror. The leader grinned at Granny, who hadn't moved a muscle. "Your peasant magic is for fools, Mother of the Night. I can strike you down where you stand." "Then strike, man," said Granny, looking over his shoulder. "If your heart tells you, strike as hard as you dare." The man raised his sword. Lightning speared down again and split a stone a few yards away, filling the air with smoke and the stink of burnt silicon. "Missed," he said smugly, and Granny saw his muscles tense as he prepared to bring the sword down. A look of extreme puzzlement crossed his face. He tilted his head sideways and opened his mouth, as if trying to come to terms with a new idea. His sword dropped out of his hand and landed point downwards in the peat. Then he gave a sigh and folded up, very gently, collapsing in a heap at Granny's feet. She gave him a gentle prod with her toe. "Perhaps you weren't aware of what I was aiming at," she whispered. "Mother of the Night, indeed." The soldier who had tried to restrain the man stared in horror at the bloody dagger in his hand and backed away. I couldn't let... He shouldn't have. It's not right to..." he stuttered. "Are you from around these parts, young man?" said Granny. He dropped to his knees. "Mad wolf, ma'am," he said. He stared back at the fallen captain. "They'll kill me now," he wailed. "But you did what you thought was right," said Granny. "I didn't become a soldier for this, not to go round killing people." "Exactly right. If I was you, I'd become a sailor," said Granny thoughtfully. "Yes, a nautical career. I should start as soon as possible. Now, in fact. Run off, man. Run off to sea where there are no tracks. You will have a long and successful life, I promise." She looked thoughtful for a moment and added, "At least longer than it's likely to be if you hang around here." He pulled himself upward, gave her a look compounded of gratitude and awe, and ran off into the mist. "And now perhaps someone will tell us what this is all about," said Granny, turning to the third man, to where the third man had been. There was the distant drumming of hooves on the turf, and then silence. Nanny Og hobbled forward. "I could catch him," she said. "What do you think?" Granny shook her head. She sat down on a rock and looked at the child in her arms. It was a boy, no more than 2 years old, and quite naked under the blanket. She rocked him vaguely and stared at nothing. Nanny Og examined the 2 corpses with the air of one for whom laying out holds no fears. "Perhaps they were bandits," said Margaret tremulously. Nanny shook her head. "A strange thing," she said. "They both wear this same badge. 2 bears on a black and gold shield. Anyone know what that means?" "It's the badge of King Verence," said Margaret. "Who's he?" said Granny Weatherwax. "He rules this country," said Margaret. "Oh, that king," said Granny, as if the matter was hardly worth noting. "Soldiers fighting one another doesn't make sense," said Nanny Og. "Margaret, you have a look in the coach." The youngest witch poked around inside the bodywork and came back with a sack. She upended it and something thudded onto the turf. The storm had rumbled off to the other side of the mountain now, and the watery moon shed a thin gruel of light over the damp moorland. It also gleamed off what was, without any doubt, an extremely important crown. "It's a crown," said Margaret. "It's got all spiky bits on it." "Oh dear," said Granny. The child gurgled in its sleep. Granny Weatherwax didn't hold with looking at the future, but now she could feel the future looking at her. She didn't like its expression at all. King Verence was looking at the past and had formed pretty much the same view. "You can see me," he said. "Oh, yes, quite clearly, in fact," said the newcomer. Verence's brows knotted. Being a ghost seemed to require considerably more mental effort than being alive. He'd managed quite well for 40 years without having to think more than once or twice a day, and now he was doing it all the time. "Ah," he said, "you're a ghost too." "Well spotted." "It was the head under your arm," said Verence, pleased with himself. "That gave me a clue." "Does it bother you? I can put it back on if it bothers you," said the old ghost helpfully. He extended his free hand. "Pleased to meet you. I'm Champot, King of Lanka." "Verence, likewise." He peered down at the old king's features and added, "Don't seem to recall seeing your picture in the long gallery." "Oh, all that was after my time," said Champot dismissively. "How long have you been here, then?" Champot reached down and rubbed his nose. "About 1,000 years, he said, his voice tinged with pride. "Man and ghost." 1,000 years? "I built this place, in fact. Just got it nicely decorated when my nephew cut my head off while I was asleep. I can't tell you how much that upset me." "But 1,000 years?" Verence repeated weakly. Champot took his arm. "It's not that bad," he confided as he led the unresisting king across the courtyard. "Better than being alive in many ways." "They must be bloody strange ways, then," snapped Verence. "I liked being alive." Champot grinned reassuringly. "You'll soon get used to it," he said. "I don't want to get used to it." "You've got a strong morphogenic field," said Champot. "I can tell. I look for these things, yes, very strong, I should say." "What's that?" "I was never very good with words, you know," said Champot. "I always found it easier to hit people with something. But I gather it all boils down to how alive you were. When you were alive, I mean, something called," he paused, "animal vitality." "Yes, that was it. Animal vitality. The more you had, the more you stay yourself, as it were, if you're a ghost. I expect you were 100% alive when you were alive," he added. Despite himself, Verence felt flattered. "I try to keep myself busy," he said. They had strolled through the wall into the great hall, which was now empty. The sight of the trestle tables triggered an automatic reaction in the king. "How do we go about getting breakfast?" he said. Champot's head looked surprised. "We don't," he said. "We're ghosts." "But I'm hungry." "You're not, you know. It's just your imagination." There was a clattering from the kitchens. The cooks were already up and, in the absence of any other instructions, were preparing the castle's normal breakfast menu. Familiar smells were wafting up from the dark archway that led to the kitchens. Verence sniffed. "Sausages," he said dreamily. "Bacon, eggs, smoked fish." He stared at Champot. "Black pudding," he whispered. "You haven't actually got a stomach," the old ghost pointed out. "It's all in the mind. Just force of habit. You just think you're hungry." "I think I'm ravenous." "Yes, but you can't actually touch anything, you see," Champot explained gently. "Nothing at all." Verence lowered himself gently onto a bench so that he did not drift through it and sank his head in his hands. He'd heard that death could be bad. He just hadn't realized how bad. He wanted revenge. He wanted to get out of this suddenly horrible castle to find his son. But he was even more terrified to find that what he really wanted right now was a plate of kidneys. A damp dawn flooded across the landscape, scaled the battlements of Lanka Castle, stormed the keep, and finally made it through the casement of the solar. Duke Felmet stared out gloomily at the dripping forest. There was such a lot of it. It wasn't, he decided, that he had anything against trees as such. It was just that the sight of so many of them was terribly depressing. He kept wanting to count them. "Indeed, my love?" he said. The Duke put those who met him in mind of some sort of lizard, possibly the type that lives on volcanic islands, moves once a day, has a vestigial third eye, and blinks on a monthly basis. He considered himself to be a civilized man, more suited to the dry air and bright sun of a properly organized climate. On the other hand, he mused, it might be nice to be a tree. Trees didn't have ears. He was pretty sure of this, and they seemed to manage without the blessed state of matrimony. A male oak tree, he'd have to look this up, a male oak tree just shed its pollen on the breeze, and all the business with the acorns, unless it was oak apples, no, he was pretty sure it was acorns, took place somewhere else. "Yes, my precious," he said. Yes, trees had got it all worked out. Duke Felmet glared at the forest roof. Selfish bastards. "Certainly, my dear," he said. "What?" said the Duchess. The Duke hesitated, desperately trying to replay the monologue of the last 5 minutes. There had been something about him being half a man and infirm on purpose, and he was sure there had been a complaint about the coldness of the castle. Yes, that was probably it. Well, those wretched trees could do a decent day's work for once. "I'll have some cut down and brought in directly, my cherished," he said. Lady Felmet was momentarily speechless. This was by way of being a calendar event. She was a large and impressive woman who gave people confronting her for the first time the impression that they were seeing a galleon under full sail. The effect was heightened by her unfortunate belief that red velvet rather suited her. However, it didn't set off her complexion. It matched it. The Duke often mused on his good luck in marrying her. If it wasn't for the engine of her ambition, he'd be just another local lord with nothing much to do but hunt, drink, and exercise his droit de seigneur.
Whatever that was. He'd never found anyone prepared to explain it to him. But it was definitely something a feudal lord ought to have, and he was pretty sure it needed regular exercise. He imagined it was some kind of large, hairy dog. He was definitely going to get one, and damn well exercise it.
Instead, he was now just a step away from the throne, and might soon be monarch of all he surveyed. Provided that all he surveyed was trees. He sighed. "Cut what down?" said Lady Felmet icily. "Oh, the trees," said the Duke. "What have trees got to do with it?" "Well, there are such a lot of them," said the Duke with feeling. "Don't change the subject." "Sorry, my sweet." "What I said was, how could you have been so stupid as to let them get away? I told you that servant was far too loyal. You can't trust someone like that." "No, my love." "You didn't by any chance consider sending someone after them, I suppose?" "Benson, my dear, and a couple of guards." "Oh." The Duchess paused. Benson, as captain of the Duke's personal bodyguard, was as efficient a killer as a psychotic mongoose. He would have been her choice. It annoyed her to be temporarily deprived of a chance to fault her husband, but she rallied quite well. "He wouldn't have needed to go out at all, if only you'd listened to me. But you never do." "Do what, my passion?" The Duke yawned. It had been a long night. There had been a thunderstorm of quite unnecessarily dramatic proportions, and then there had been all that messy business with their knives. It has already been mentioned that Duke Felmet was one step away from the throne. The step in question was at the top of the flight leading to the great hall, down which King Verence had tumbled in the dark, only to land, against all the laws of probability, on his own dagger. It had, however, been declared by his own physician to be a case of natural causes. Benson had gone to see the man and explained that falling down a flight of steps with a dagger in your back was a disease caused by unwise opening of the mouth. In fact, it had already been caught by several members of the king's own bodyguard, who had been a little bit hard of hearing. There had been a minor epidemic. The Duke shuddered. There were details about last night that were both hazy and horrible. He tried to reassure himself that all the unpleasantness was over now, and he had a kingdom. It wasn't much of one, apparently being mainly trees, but it was a kingdom, and it had a crown. If only they could find it. Lancre Castle was built on an outcrop of rock by an architect who had heard about Gormenghast but hadn't got the budget. He'd done his best, though, with a tiny confection of cut-price turrets, bargain basements, buttresses, crenellations, gargoyles, towers, courtyards, keeps and dungeons. In fact, just about everything a castle needs, except maybe reasonable foundations and the kind of mortar that doesn't wash away in a light shower. The castle leaned vertiginously over the racing white water of the Lancre River, which boomed darkly 1,000 feet below. Every now and again, a few bits fell in. Small as it was, though, the castle contained 1,000 places to hide a crown. The Duchess swept out to find someone else to berate, and left Lord Felmet looking gloomily at the landscape. It started to rain. It was on this cue that there came a thunderous knocking at the castle door. It seriously disturbed the castle porter, who was playing Cripple Mr. Onion with the castle cook and the castle's fool in the warmth of the kitchen. He growled and stood up. "There is a knocking without," he said. "Without what?" said the fool. "Without the door, idiot." The fool gave him a worried look. "A knocking without a door?" he said suspiciously. "This isn't some kind of Zen, is it?" When the porter had grumbled off in the direction of the gatehouse, the cook pushed another farthing into the kitty and looked sharply over his cards at the fool. "What's a Zen?" he said. The fool's bells tinkled as he sorted through his cards. Without thinking, he said, "Oh, a subsect of the Turnwiseclatch philosophical system of Sumtin, noted for its simple austerity and the offer of personal tranquility and wholeness, achieved through meditation and breathing techniques. An interesting aspect is the asking of apparently nonsensical questions in order to widen the doors of perception." "How's that again?" said the cook suspiciously. He was on edge. When he'd taken the breakfast up to the great hall, he'd kept getting the feeling that something was trying to take the tray out of his hands. And as if that wasn't bad enough, this new duke had sent him back for... He shuddered. Oatmeal and a runny boiled egg. The cook was too old for this sort of thing. He was set in his ways. He was a cook in the real feudal tradition. If it didn't have an apple in its mouth and you couldn't roast it, he didn't want to serve it. The fool hesitated with a card in his hand, suppressed his panic, and thought quickly. "I'faith, nuncle," he squeaked, "thou art more full of questions than a Martlebury is of mizzen sails." The cook relaxed. "Well, okay," he said, not entirely satisfied. The fool lost the next 3 hands, just to be on the safe side. The porter, meanwhile, unfastened the hatch in the wicket gate and peered out. "Who does knock without?" he growled. The soldier, drenched and terrified though he was, hesitated. "Without? Without what?" he said. "If you're going to bugger about, you can bloody well stay without all day," said the porter calmly. "No, I must see the Duke upon the instant," shouted the guard. "Witches are abroad." The porter was about to come back with, "Good time of year for it," or "Wish I was too," but stopped when he saw the man's face. It wasn't the face of a man who would enter into the spirit of the thing. It was the look of someone who had seen things a decent man shouldn't wot of. "Witches?" said Lord Felmet. "Witches?" said the Duchess. In the draughty corridors, a voice as faint as the wind in distant keyholes said with a note of hope, "Witches?" The psychically inclined. "It's meddling, that's what it is," said Granny Weatherwax, "and no good will come of it." "It's very romantic," said Margaret breathily, and heaved a sigh. "Goochie goo," said Nanny Og. "Anyway," said Margaret, "you killed that horrid man." I never did. I just encouraged things to take their course. Granny Weatherwax frowned. He didn't have no respect. Once people lose their respect, it means trouble. Easy wizzy wazzy then. That other man brought him out here to save him, shouted Margaret. He wanted us to keep him safe. It's obvious. It's destiny. Oh, obvious, said Granny. I'll grant you it's obvious. Trouble is, just because things are obvious doesn't mean they're true. She weighed the crown in her hands. It felt very heavy in a way that went beyond mere pounds and ounces. Yes, but the point is, Margaret began. The point is, said Granny, that people are going to come looking. Serious people, serious looking, pull down the walls and burn off the thatch looking, and... How's the boy done? And Gither. I'm sure we'll all be a lot happier if you'd stop gurgling like that. Granny snapped. She could feel her nerves coming on. Her nerves always played up when she was unsure about things. Besides, they had retired to Margaret's cottage and the decor was getting to her. Because Margaret believed in nature's wisdom and elves and the healing power of colours and the cycle of seasons and a lot of other things Granny Weatherwax didn't have any truck with. You're not telling me how to look after a child, snapped Nanny Og mildly. And me with 15 of my own? I'm just saying that we ought to think about it, said Granny. The other two watched her for some time. Well, said Margaret. Granny's fingers drummed on the edge of the crown. She frowned. First, we've got to take him away from here, she said, and held up a hand. No, Gither, I'm sure your cottage is ideal and everything, but it's not safe. He's got to be somewhere away from here, a long way away, where no one knows who he is. And then there's this. She tossed the crown from hand to hand. Oh, that's easy, said Margaret. I mean, you just hide it under a stone or something. That's easy. Much easier than babies. It ain't, said Granny. The reason being, the country's full of babies and they all look the same, but I don't reckon there's many crowns. They have this way of being found anyway. They kind of call out to people's minds. If you bunged it under a stone up here, in a week's time it'd get itself discovered by accident. You mark my words. It's true as that, said Nanny Og earnestly. How many times have you thrown a magic ring into the deepest depths of the ocean and then when you get home and have a nice bit of turbot for your tea, there it is? They considered this in silence. Never, said Granny irritably. And nor have you. Anyway, he might want it back. If it's rightfully his, that is. Kings set a lot of store by crowns. Really, Gither, sometimes you say the most. I'll just make some tea, shall I? Said Margaret brightly, and disappeared into the scullery. The two elderly witches sat on either side of the table in polite and prickly silence. Finally Nanny Og said, She done it up nice, hasn't she? Flowers and everything. What are them things on the walls? Sigils, said Granny sourly. Or some such. Fancy, said Nanny Og politely. And all of them robes and wands and things too. Modern, said Granny Weatherwax with a sniff. When I was a girl, we had a lump of wax and a couple of pins and had to be content. We had to make our own enchantment in them days. Ah, well, we've all passed a lot of water since then, said Nanny Og sagely. She gave the baby a comforting jiggle. Granny Weatherwax sniffed. Nanny Og had been married 3 times and ruled a tribe of children and grandchildren all over the kingdom. Certainly it was not actually forbidden for witches to get married. Granny had to concede that, but reluctantly. Very reluctantly. She sniffed again, disapprovingly. This was a mistake. What's that smell? She snapped. Ah, said Nanny Og, carefully repositioning the baby. I expect I'll just go and see if Margaret has any clean rags, shall I? And now Granny was left alone. She felt embarrassed, as one always does when left alone in someone else's room, and fought the urge to get up and inspect the books on the shelf over the sideboard or examine the mantelpiece for dust. She turned the crown round and round in her hands. Again, it gave the impression of being bigger and heavier than it actually was. She caught sight of the mirror over the mantelpiece and looked down at the crown. It was tempting. It was practically begging her to try it for size. Well, and why not? She made sure that the others weren't around, and then in one movement whipped off her hat and placed the crown on her head. It seemed to fit. Granny drew herself up proudly and waved a hand imperiously in the general direction of the hearth. "Jolly well do this," she said. She beckoned arrogantly at the grandfather clock. "Chop his head off, what ho!" she commanded. She smiled grimly and froze as she heard the screams and the thunder of horses and the deadly whisper of arrows and the damp, solid sound of spears in flesh. Charge after charge echoed across her skull. Sword met shield or sword or bone relentlessly. Years streamed across her mind in the space of a second. There were times when she lay among the dead or hanging from the branch of a tree, but always there were hands that would pick her up again and place her on a velvet cushion. Granny very carefully lifted the crown off her head. It was an effort. It didn't like it much, and laid it on the table. "So that's being a king for you, is it?" she said softly. "I wonder why they all want the job." "Do you take sugar?" said Margaret behind her. "You'd have to be a born fool to be a king," said Granny. "Sorry?" Granny turned. "Didn't see you come in," she said. "What was it you said?" "Sugar in your tea?" "3 spoons," said Granny promptly. It was one of the few sorrows of Granny Weatherwax's life that, despite all her efforts, she'd arrived at the peak of her career with a complexion like a rosy apple and all her teeth. No amount of charms could persuade a wart to take root on her handsome, if slightly equine features, and vast intakes of sugar only served to give her boundless energy. A wizard she'd consulted had explained it was on account of her having a metabolism, which at least allowed her to feel vaguely superior to Nanny Ogg, who she suspected had never ever seen one. Margaret dutifully dug out 3 heaped ones. It would be nice, she thought wistfully, if someone could say thank you occasionally. She became aware that the crown was staring at her. "You can feel it, can you?" said Granny. "I said, didn't I? Crowns call out." "It's horrible." No, it's just being what it is. It can't help it." "But it's magic." "It's just being what it is," Granny repeated. "It's trying to get me to try it on," said Margaret, her hand hovering. "It does that, yes." "But I shall be strong," said Margaret. "So I should think," said Granny, her expression suddenly curiously wooden. "What's Githa doing?" "She's giving the baby a wash in the sink," said Margaret vaguely. "How can we hide something like this? What'd happen if we buried it really deeply somewhere?" "A badger'd dig it up," said Granny wearily. "Or someone'd go prospecting for gold or something. Or a tree'd tangle its roots around it and then be blown over in a storm and then someone'd pick it up and put it on." "Unless they were as strong-minded as us," Margaret pointed out. "Unless that, of course," said Granny, staring at her fingernails. "Though the thing with crowns is, it isn't the putting them on that's the problem, it's the taking them off." Margaret picked it up and turned it over in her hands. "It's not as though it even looks much like a crown," she said. "You've seen a lot, I expect," said Granny. "You'd be an expert on them, naturally." "Seen a fair few. They've got a lot more jewels on them and cloth bits in the middle," said Margaret defiantly. "This is just a thin little thing." Margaret Garlick. "I have. When I was being trained up by Goody Wemper, may she rest in peace, may she rest in peace, she used to take me over to Razorback or into Lanka whenever the strolling players were in town. She was very keen on the theatre. They've got more crowns than you can shake a stick at, although mind..." She paused. "Goody did say they're made of tin and paper and stuff, and just glass for the jewels, but they look more realer than this one. Do you think that's strange?" "Things that try to look like things often do look more like things than things. Well-known fact," said Granny. "But I don't hold with encouraging it." What do they stroll about playing, then, in these crowns?" "You don't know about the theatre?" said Margaret. Granny Weatherwax, who never declared her ignorance of anything, didn't hesitate. "Oh, yes," she said. "It's one of them styles of things, then, is it?" "Goody Wemper said it held a mirror up to life," said Margaret. "She said it always cheered her up." "I expect it would," said Granny, striking out. "Played properly, at any rate. Good people, are they, these theatre players?" "I think so." "And they stroll around the country, you say?" said Granny thoughtfully, looking towards the scullery door. "All over the place. There's a troupe in Lanka now, I heard. I haven't been because, you know," Margaret looked down, "'tis not right, a woman going into such places by herself." Granny nodded. She thoroughly approved of such sentiments, so long as there was, of course, no suggestion that they applied to her. She drummed her fingers on Margaret's tablecloth. "Right," she said. "And why not? Go and tell Githa to wrap the baby up well. It's a long time since I heard a theatre played properly." Margaret was entranced as usual. The theatre was no more than some lengths of painted sacking, a plank stage laid over a few barrels, and 6 benches set out in the village square. But at the same time, it had also managed to become the castle, another part of the castle, the same part a little later, the battlefield, and now it was a road outside the city. The afternoon would have been perfect if it wasn't for Granny Weatherwax. After several piercing glares at the 3-man orchestra to see if she could work out which instrument the theatre was, the old witch had finally paid attention to the stage, and it was beginning to become apparent to Margaret that there were certain fundamental aspects of the theatre that Granny had not yet grasped. She was currently bouncing up and down on her stool with rage. "He's killed him," she hissed. "Why isn't anyone doing anything about it? He's killed him, and right up there in front of everyone." Margaret held on desperately to her colleague's arm as she struggled to get to her feet. "It's all right," she whispered. "He's not dead." "Are you calling me a liar, my girl?" snapped Granny. "I saw it all." "Look, Granny, it's not really real, do you see?" Granny Weatherwax subsided a little, but still grumbled under her breath. She was beginning to feel that things were trying to make a fool of her. Up on the stage, a man in a sheet was giving a spirited monologue. Granny listened intently for some minutes, and then nudged Margaret in the ribs. "What's he on about now?" she demanded. "He's saying how sorry he was that the other man's dead," said Margaret, and in an attempt to change the subject added hurriedly, "There's a lot of crowns, isn't there?" Granny was not to be distracted. "What did he go and kill him for, then?" she said. "Well, it's a bit complicated," said Margaret weakly. "It's shameful," snapped Granny, "and the poor dead thing still lying there." Margaret gave an imploring look to Nanny Ogg, who was masticating an apple and studying the stage with the glare of a research scientist. "I reckon," she said slowly, "I reckon it's all just pretending. Look, he's still breathing." The rest of the audience, who by now had already decided that this commentary was all part of the play, stared as one man at the corpse. It blushed. "And look at his boots, too," said Nanny critically. "A real king would be ashamed of boots like that." The corpse tried to shuffle its feet behind a cardboard bush. Granny, feeling in some obscure way that they had scored a minor triumph over the purveyors of untruth and artifice, helped herself to an apple from the bag and began to take a fresh interest. Margaret's nerves started to unknot, and she began to settle down to enjoy the play. But not, as it turned out, for very long. Her willing suspension of disbelief was interrupted by a voice saying, "What's this bit?" Margaret sighed. "Well," she hazarded, "he thinks that he is the prince, but he's really the other king's daughter dressed up as a man." Granny subjected the actor to a long, analytical stare. "He is a man," she said, "in a straw wig. making his voice squeaky. Margaret shuddered. She knew a little about the conventions of the theatre. She had been dreading this bit. Granny Weatherwax had views. Yes, but, she said wretchedly, it's the theatre, see? All the women are played by men. Why? They don't allow no women on the stage, said Margaret in a small voice. She shut her eyes. In fact, there was no outburst from the seat on her left. She risked a quick glance. Granny was quietly chewing the same bit of apple over and over again, her eyes never leaving the action. Don't make a fuss, Esme, said Nanny, who also knew about Granny's views. This is a good bit. I reckon I'm getting the hang of it. Someone tapped Granny on the shoulder and a voice said, Madam, will you kindly remove your hat? Granny turned around very slowly on her stool, as though propelled by hidden motors, and subjected the interrupter to 100-kilowatt diamond blue stare. The man wilted under it and sagged back onto his stool, her face following him all the way down. No, she said. He considered the options. All right, he said. Granny turned back and nodded to the actors who had paused to watch her. I don't know what you're staring at, she growled. Get on with it. Nanny Ogg passed her another bag. Have a humbug, she said. Silence again filled the makeshift theatre, except for the hesitant voices of the actors who kept glancing at the bristling figure of Granny Weatherwax, and the sucking sounds of a couple of boiled humbugs being relentlessly churned from cheek to cheek. Then Granny said, in a piercing voice that made one actor drop his wooden sword, There's a man over on the side there whispering to them. He's a prompter, said Margaret. He tells them what to say. Don't they know? I think they're forgetting, said Margaret sourly, for some reason. Granny nudged Nanny Ogg. What's going on now? She said. Why are all them kings and people up there? It's a banquet, see, said Nanny Ogg authoritatively. Because of the dead king, him in the boots, as was. Only now if you look, you'll see he's pretending to be a soldier and everyone's making speeches about how good he was and wondering who killed him. Are they? Said Granny grimly. She cast her eyes along the cast, looking for the murderer. She was making up her mind. Then she stood up. Her black shawl billowed around her like the wings of an avenging angel, come to rid the world of all that was foolishness and pretense and artifice and sham. She seemed somehow a lot bigger than normal. She pointed an angry finger at the guilty party. He done it, she shouted triumphantly. We all seed him. He done it with a dagger. The audience filed out, contented. It had been a good play on the whole, they decided, although not very easy to follow. But it had been a jolly good laugh when all the kings had run off and the woman in black had jumped up and did all the shouting. That alone had been well worth the halfpenny admission. The three witches sat alone on the edge of the stage. I wonder how they get all them kings and lords to come here and do this, said Granny, totally unabashed. I'd have thought they'd been too busy, ruling and similar. No, said Margaret wearily. I still don't think you quite understand. Well, I'm going to get to the bottom of it, snapped Granny. She got back onto the stage and pulled aside the sacking curtains. You, she shouted, you're dead. The luckless former corpse, who was eating a ham sandwich to calm his nerves, fell backwards off his stool. Granny kicked a bush. Her boot went right through it. See, she said to the world in general, in a strangely satisfied voice. Nothing's real. It's all just paint and sticks and paper at the back. May I assist you, good ladies? It was a rich and wonderful voice, with every diphthong gliding beautifully into place. It was a golden brown voice. If the creator of the multiverse had a voice, it was a voice such as this. If it had a drawback, it was that it wasn't a voice you could use, for example, for ordering coal. Coal ordered by this voice would become diamonds. It apparently belonged to a large fat man who had been badly savaged by a moustache. Pink veins made a map of quite a large city on his cheeks. His nose could have hidden successfully in a bowl of strawberries. He wore a ragged jerkin and holey tights, with an aplomb that nearly convinced you that his velvet and vermin robes were in the wash just at the moment. In one hand he held a trowel, with which he had clearly been removing the makeup that still greased his features. "I know you," said Granny. "You done the murder." She looked sideways at Margaret and admitted grudgingly, "Leastways, it looked like it." "So glad. It is always a pleasure to meet a true connoisseur." "Olwyn Vitteler, at your service, manager of this band of vagabonds," said the man, and removing his moth-eaten hat, he treated her to a low bow. It was less an obeisance than an exercise in advanced topology. The hat swerved and jerked through a series of complex arcs, ending up at the end of an arm which was now pointing in the direction of the sky. One of his legs, meanwhile, had wandered off behind him. The rest of his body sagged politely until his head was level with Granny's knees. "Yes, well," said Granny. She felt that her clothes had grown a bit larger and much hotter. "I thought you was very good too," said Nanny Ogg. "The way you shouted all them words so graciously, I could tell you was a king." "I hope we didn't upset things," said Margaret. "My dear lady," said Vittula, "could I begin to tell you how gratifying it is for a mere mummer to learn that his audience has seen behind the mere shell of grease paint to the spirit beneath?" "I expect you could," said Granny. "I expect you could say anything, Mr. Vittula." He replaced his hat, and their eyes met in the long and calculating stare of one professional weighing up another. Vittula broke first, and tried to pretend he hadn't been competing. "And now," he said, "to what do I owe this visit from three such charming ladies?" In fact, he'd won. Granny's mouth fell open. She would not have described herself as anything much above handsome, considering. Nanny, on the other hand, was as gummy as a baby and had a face like a small dried raisin. The best you could say for Margaret was that she was decently plain and well scrubbed and as flat-chested as an ironing board with a couple of peas on it, even if her head was too well stuffed with fancies. Granny could feel something, some sort of magic at work, but not the kind she was used to. It was Vittula's voice. By the mere process of articulation, it transformed everything it talked about. "Look at the two of them," she told herself, primping away like a couple of ninnies. Granny stopped her hand in the process of patting her own iron-hard bun and cleared her throat meaningfully. "We'd like to talk to you, Mr. Vittula." She indicated the actors who were dismantling the set and staying well out of her way, and added in a conspiratorial whisper, "Somewhere private." "Dear lady, but of a certain," he said. "Currently I have lodgings in yonder esteemed watering-hole." The witches looked around. Eventually, Margaret risked, "You mean in the pub?" It was cold and draughty in the great hall of Lanka Castle, and the new Chamberlain's bladder wasn't getting any younger. He stood and squirmed under the gaze of Lady Felmet. "Oh, yes," he said. "We've got them all right, lots." "And people don't do anything about them?" said the Duchess. The Chamberlain blinked. "I'm sorry?" he said. "People tolerate them?" "Oh, indeed," said the Chamberlain happily. "It's considered good luck to have a witch living in your village. My word, yes." "Why?" The Chamberlain hesitated. The last time he had resorted to a witch, it had been because certain rectal problems had turned the privy into a daily torture chamber, and the jar of ointment she had prepared had turned the world into a nicer place. "They smooth out life's little humps and bumps," he said. "Where I come from, we don't allow witches," said the Duchess sternly, "and we don't propose to allow them here. You will furnish us with their addresses." "Addresses, ladyship?" "Where they live. I trust your tax-gatherers know where to find them?" "Ah," said the Chamberlain miserably. The Duke leaned forward on his throne. "I trust," he said, "that they do pay taxes." "Not exactly pay taxes, my lord," said the Chamberlain. There was silence. Finally the Duke prompted. "Go on, man." "Well, it's more that they don't pay, you see. We never felt, that is, the old king didn't think. Well, they just don't." The Duke laid a hand on his wife's arm. "I see," he said coldly. "Very well, you may go." The Chamberlain gave him a brief nod of relief and scuttled crabwise from the hall. "Well," said the Duchess, "indeed. That was how your family used to run a kingdom, was it? You had a positive duty to kill your cousin. It was clearly in the interests of the species," said the Duchess. "The weak don't deserve to survive." The Duke shivered. She would keep on reminding him. He didn't, on the whole, object to killing people, or at least ordering them to be killed and then watching it happen. But killing a kinsman rather stuck in the throat, or, he recalled, the liver. "Quite so," he managed. "Of course there would appear to be many witches, and it might be difficult to find the 3 that were on the moor." "That doesn't matter." "Of course not." "Put matters in hand." "Yes, my love, matters in hand." He'd put matters in hand, all right. If he closed his eyes, he could see the body tumbling down the steps. Had there been a hiss of shocked breath down in the darkness of the hall? He'd been certain they were alone. Matters in hand. He'd tried to wash the blood off his hand. If he could wash the blood off, he told himself, it wouldn't have happened. He'd scrubbed and scrubbed. Scrubbed till he screamed. Granny wasn't at home in public houses. She sat stiffly to attention behind her port and lemon, as if it were a shield against the lures of the world. Nanny Ogg, on the other hand, was enthusiastically downing her 3rd drink, and, Granny thought sourly, was well along that path which would probably end up with her usual dancing on the table, showing her petticoats and singing, "The hedgehog can never be buggered at all." The table was covered with copper coins. Vittula and his wife sat at either end, counting. It was something of a race. Granny considered Mrs. Vittula as she snatched farthings from under her husband's fingers. She was an intelligent-looking woman who appeared to treat her husband much as a sheepdog treats a favourite lamb. The complexities of the marital relationship were known to Granny only from a distance, in the same way that an astronomer can view the surface of a remote and alien world. But it had already occurred to her that a wife to Vittula would have to be a very special woman with bottomless reserves of patience and organisational ability and nimble fingers. "Mrs. Vittula," she said eventually, "may I make so bold as to ask if your union has been blessed with fruit?" The couple looked blank. "She means—" Nanny Ogg began. "No, I see," said Mrs. Vittula quietly. "No. We had a little girl once." A small cloud hung over the table. For a second or two, Vittula looked merely human-sized and much older. He stared at the small pile of cash in front of him. "Only, you see, there is this child," said Granny, indicating the baby in Nanny Ogg's arms, "and he needs a home." The Vittulas stared. Then the man sighed. "It is no life for a child," he said. "Always moving, always a new town, and no room for schooling. They say that's very important these days." But his eyes didn't look away. Mrs. Vittula said, "Why does he need a home?" "He hasn't got one," said Granny. "At least, not one where he would be welcome." The silence continued. Then Mrs. Vittula said, "And you, who ask this, you are by way of being his—" "Godmothers," said Nanny Ogg promptly. Granny was slightly taken aback. It never would have occurred to her. Vittula played abstractly with the coins in front of him. His wife reached out across the table and touched his hand, and there was a moment of unspoken communion. Granny looked away. She had grown expert at reading faces, but there were times when she preferred not to. Money is alas tight, Vitaly began. But it will stretch, said his wife firmly. Yes, I think it will. We should be happy to take care of him. Granny nodded and fished in the deepest recesses of her cloak. At last she produced a small leather bag which she tipped out onto the table. There was a lot of silver and even a few tiny gold coins. This should take care of, she groped, nappies and such like, clothes and things, whatever. 100 times over, I should think, said Vitaly weakly. Why didn't you mention this before? If I'd had to buy you, you wouldn't be worth the price. But you don't know anything about us, said Mrs. Vitaly. We don't, do we? Said Granny calmly. Naturally, we'd like to hear how he gets along. You could send us letters and such like. But it would not be a good idea to talk about all this after you've left, do you see, for the sake of the child. Mrs. Vitaly looked at the two old women. There's something else here, isn't there? She said. Something big behind all this. Granny hesitated and then nodded. But it would do us no good at all to know it. Another nod. Granny stood up as several actors came in, breaking the spell. Actors had a habit of filling all the space around them. I have other things to see to, she said. Please excuse me. What's his name? Said Vitaly. Tom, said Granny, hardly hesitating. John, said Nanny. The two witches exchanged glances. Granny won. Tom John, she said firmly, and swept out. She met a breathless Margaret outside the door. I found a box, she said. It had all the crowns and things in, so I put it, like you said, right underneath everything. Good, said Granny. Our crown looked really tatty compared to the others. It just goes to show, doesn't it? Said Granny. Did anyone see you? No, everyone was too busy, but... Margaret hesitated and blushed. Out with it, girl. Just after that, a man came up and pinched my bottom. Margaret went a deep crimson and slapped her hand over her mouth. Did he? Said Granny. And then what? And then... Yes? He said... What did he say? He said, hello, my lovely, what are you doing tonight? Granny ruminated on this for a while, and then she said, Old Goody Whemper. She didn't get out and about much, did she? It was her leg, you know, said Margaret. But she taught you all the midwifery and everything. Oh, yes, that, said Margaret. I done lots. But, Granny hesitated, groping her way across unfamiliar territory. She never talked about what you might call the previous. Sorry? You know, said Granny with an edge of desperation in her voice. Men and such. Margaret looked as if she was about to panic. What about them? Granny Weatherwax had done many unusual things in her time, and it took a lot to make her refuse a challenge, but this time she gave in. I think, she said helplessly, that it might be a good idea if you have a quiet word with Nanny Og one of these days, fairly soon. There was a cackle of laughter from the window behind them, a chink of glasses, and a thin voice raised in song. With a giraffe, if you stand on a stool, but the hedgehog... Granny stopped listening. Only not just now, she added. The troop got under way a few hours before sunset, their 4 carts lurching off down the road that led towards the Stowe Plains and the big cities. Lanka had a town rule that all mummers, mountebanks, and other potential criminals were outside the gates by sundown. It didn't offend anyone really, because the town had no walls to speak of, and no one much minded if people nipped back in again after dark. It was the look of the thing that counted. The witches watched from Margaret's cottage, using Nanny Og's ancient green crystal ball. It's about time you learned how to get sound on this thing, Granny muttered. She gave it a nudge, filling the image with ripples. It was very strange, said Margaret. In those carts. The things they had, paper trees and all kinds of costumes and... She waved her hands. There was this great big picture of 4 parts, with all temples and things all rolled up. It was beautiful. Granny grunted. I thought it was amazing the way all those people became kings and things, didn't you? It was like magic. Margaret Garlick, what are you saying? It was just paint and paper. Anyone could see that. Margaret opened her mouth to speak, ran the ensuing argument through her head and shut it again. Where's Nanny? She said. She's lying out on the lawn, said Granny. She felt a bit poorly. And from outside came the sound of Nanny Ogg being poorly at the top of her voice. Margaret sighed. You know, she said, if we are his godmothers, we ought to have given him 3 gifts. It's traditional. What are you talking about, girl? 3 good witches are supposed to give the baby 3 gifts. You know, like good looks, wisdom and happiness. Margaret pressed on defiantly. That's how it used to be done in the old days. Oh, you mean gingerbread cottages and all that, said Granny dismissively. Spinning wheels and pumpkins and pricking your finger on rose thorns and similar. I could never be having with all that. She polished the ball reflectively. Yes, but... Margaret said. Granny glanced up at her. That was Margaret for you. Head full of pumpkins. Everyone's fairy godmother for 2 pins. But a good soul underneath it all. Kind to small furry animals. The sort of person who worried about baby birds falling out of nests. Look, if it makes you any happier, she muttered, surprised at herself. She waved her hands vaguely over the image of the departing carts. What's it to be? Wealth? Beauty? Well, money isn't everything, and if he takes after his father, he'll be handsome enough. Margaret said, suddenly serious. Wisdom, do you think? That's something he'll have to learn for himself, said Granny. Perfect eyesight? A good singing voice? From the lawn outside came Nanny Ogg's cracked but enthusiastic voice, telling the night sky that a wizard's staff has a knob on the end. Not important, said Granny loudly. You've got to think headology, see? Not muck about with all this beauty and wealth business. That's not important. She turned back to the ball and gestured half-heartedly. You'd better go and get Nanny then, seeing as there should be 3 of us. Nanny was helped in, eventually, and had to have things explained to her. 3 gifts, eh? She said. Haven't done one of them things since I was a girl. It takes me back. What are you doing? Margaret was bustling around the room lighting candles. Oh, we've got to create the right magical ambience, she explained. Granny shrugged but said nothing, even in the face of the extreme provocation. All witches did their magic in their own way, and this was Margaret's house. What are we going to give him then? Said Nanny. We was just discussing it, said Granny. I know what he'll want, said Nanny. She made a suggestion which was received in frozen silence. I don't see what use that would be, said Margaret eventually. Wouldn't it be rather uncomfortable? You'll thank us when he grows up, you mark my words, said Nanny. My first husband, he always said, something a bit less physical is generally the style of things, interrupted Granny, staring at Nanny Ogg. There's no need to go and spoil everything, Githa. Why do you always have to... Well, at least I can say that I... Nanny began. Both voices faded to a mutter. There was a long, edgy silence. I think, said Margaret with brittle brightness, that perhaps it would be a good idea if we all go back to our little cottages and do it in our own way. You know, separately. It's been a long day and we're all rather tired. Good idea, said Granny firmly and stood up. Come, Nanny Ogg, she snapped. It's been a long day and we're all rather tired. Margaret heard them bickering as they wandered down the path. She sat rather sadly amidst the coloured candles, holding a small bottle of extremely thaumaturgical incense that she had ordered from a magical supplies emporium in faraway Ankh-Morpork. She had been rather looking forward to trying it. Sometimes she thought it would be nice if people could be a bit kinder. She stared at the ball. Well, she could make a start. "He will make friends easily," she whispered. It wasn't much, she knew, but it was something she'd never been able to get the hang of. Nanny Ogg, sitting alone in her kitchen with her huge tom-cat curled up on her lap, poured herself a nightcap and through the haze tried to remember the words of verse 17 of the Hedgehog song. There was something about goats, she recalled, but the details eluded her. Time abraded memory. She toasted the invisible presence. "A bloody good memory is what he ought to have," she said. "He'll always remember the words." And Granny Weatherwax, striding home alone through the midnight forest, wrapped her shawl around her and considered. It had been a long day and a trying one. The theatre had been the worst part. All people pretending to be other people, things happening that weren't real, bits of countryside you could put your foot through. Granny liked to know where she stood, and she wasn't certain she stood for that sort of thing. The world seemed to be changing all the time. It didn't used to change so much. It was bewildering. She walked quickly through the darkness with the frank stride of someone who was at least certain that the forest, on this damp and windy night, contained strange and terrible things, and she was it. "Let him be whoever he thinks he is," she said. "That's all anybody could hope for in this world." Like most people, witches are unfocused in time. The difference is that they dimly realize it and make use of it. They cherish the past because part of them is still living there, and they can see the shadows the future casts before it. Granny could feel the shape of the future, and it had knives in it. It began at 5 the next morning. 4 men rode through the woods near Granny's cottage, tethered the horses out of earshot, and crept very cautiously through the mists. The sergeant in charge was not happy in his work. He was a Ramtops man, and wasn't at all certain about how you went about arresting a witch. He was pretty certain, though, that the witch wouldn't like the idea. He didn't like the idea of a witch not liking the idea. The men were Ramtoppers as well. They were following him very closely, ready to duck behind him at the first sign of anything more unexpected than a tree. Granny's cottage was a fungoid shape in the mist. Her unruly herb garden seemed to move, even in the still air. It contained plants seen nowhere else in the mountains, their roots and seeds traded across 5,000 miles of the Discworld, and the sergeant could swear that 1 or 2 blooms turned towards him. He shuddered. "What now, Sarge?" We spread out," he said. "Yep, we spread out. That's what we do." They moved carefully through the bracken. The sergeant crouched behind a handy log and said, "Right, very good. You got the general idea. Now let's spread out again, and this time we spread out separately." The men grumbled a bit, but disappeared into the mist. The sergeant gave them a few minutes to take up positions, then said, "Right, now we—" He paused. He wondered whether he dared shout, and decided against it. He stood up. He removed his helmet to show respect, and sidled through the damp grass to the back door. He knocked, very gently. After a wait of several seconds, he clamped his helmet back on his head, said, "No one in, blast," and started to stride away. The door opened. It opened very slowly, and with the maximum amount of creak. Simple neglect wouldn't have caused that depth of groan. You'd need careful work with hot water over a period of weeks. The sergeant stopped, and then turned round very slowly while contriving to move as few muscles as possible. He had mixed feelings about the fact that there was nothing in the doorway. In his experience, doors didn't just open themselves. He cleared his throat nervously. Granny Weatherwax, right by his ear, said, "That's a nasty cough you've got there. You did right in coming to me." The sergeant looked up at her with an expression of mad gratitude. He said, "She did what?" said the Duke. The sergeant stared fixedly at an area a few inches to the right of the Duke's chair. "She give me a cup of tea, sir," he said. "And what about your men?" "She give them one too, sir." The Duke rose from his chair and put his arms around the sergeant's rusting chainmail shoulders. He was in a bad mood. He had spent half the night washing his hands. He kept thinking that something was whispering in his ear. His breakfast, oatmeal, had been served up too salty and roasted with an apple in it, and the cook had hysterics in the kitchen. You could tell the Duke was extremely annoyed. He was polite. The Duke was the kind of man who becomes more and more agreeable as his temper drains away until the point is reached where the words, "Thank you so much," have the cutting edge of a guillotine. "Sergeant," he said, walking the man slowly across the floor. "Sir?" "I'm not sure I made your orders clear, Sergeant," said the Duke in snake tones. "Sir?" "I mean, it is possible I may have confused you. I meant to say, bring me a witch in chains if necessary, but perhaps what I really said was go and have a cup of tea. Was this, in fact, the case?" The sergeant wrinkled his forehead. Sarcasm had not hitherto entered his life. His experience of people being annoyed with him generally involved shouting and occasional bits of wood. "No, sir," he said. "I wonder why, then, you did not in fact do this thing that I asked." "Sir?" "I expect she said some magic words, did she?" "I've heard about witches," said the Duke, who had spent the night before reading until his bandaged hands shook too much, some of the more excitable works on the subject.
Written by wizards who are celibate and get some pretty funny ideas around 4 o'clock in the morning.
"I imagine she offered you visions of unearthly delight. Did she show you," the Duke shuddered, "dark fascinations and forbidden raptures, the like of which mortal men should not even think of, and demonic secrets that took you to the depths of man's desires?" The Duke sat down and fanned himself with his handkerchief. "Are you all right, sir?" said the sergeant. "What?" "Oh, perfectly, perfectly." "Only you've gone all red." "Don't change the subject, man," snapped the Duke, pulling himself together a bit. "Admit it. She offered you hedonistic and licentious pleasures known only to those who dabble in the carnal arts, didn't she?" The sergeant stood to attention and stared straight ahead. "No, sir," he said, in the manner of one speaking the truth, come what may. "She offered me a bun." "A bun?" "Yes, sir. It had currants in it." Felmet sat absolutely still while he fought for internal peace. Finally, all he could manage was, "And what did your men do about this?" "They had a bun too, sir. All except young Roger, who isn't allowed fruit, sir, on account of his trouble." The Duke sagged back on the window seat and put his hand over his eyes. "I was born to rule down on the plains," he thought, "where it's all flat, and there isn't all this weather and everything, and there are people who don't appear to be made of dough. He's going to tell me what this Roger had." "He had a biscuit, sir." The Duke stared out at the trees. He was angry. He was extremely angry. But 20 years of marriage to Lady Felmet had taught him not simply to control his emotions, but to control his instincts as well, and not so much as the twitching of a muscle indicated the workings of his mind. Besides, arising out of the black depths of his head was an emotion that hitherto he had little time for. Curiosity was flashing a fin. The Duke had managed quite well for 50 years without finding a use for curiosity. It was not a trait much encouraged in aristocrats. He had found certainty was a much better bet. However, it occurred to him that for once curiosity might have its uses. The sergeant was standing in the middle of the floor with the stolid air of one who is awaiting a word of command, and who is quite prepared so to wait until continental drift budges him from his post. He had been in the undemanding service of the kings of Lanka for many years, and it showed. His body was standing to attention. Despite all his efforts, his stomach stood at ease. The Duke's gaze fell on the fool, who was sitting on his stool by the throne. The hunched figure looked up, embarrassed, and gave his bells a half-hearted shake. The Duke reached a decision. The way to progress, he'd found, was to find weak spots. He tried to shut away the thought that these included such things as a king's kidneys at the top of a dark stairway, and concentrated on the matter in hand. He'd scrubbed and scrubbed, but it seemed to have no effect. Eventually he'd gone down to the dungeons and borrowed one of the torturer's wire brushes and scrubbed with that too. That had no effect either. It made it worse. The harder he scrubbed, the more blood there was. He was afraid he might go mad. He wrestled the thought to the back of his mind. Weak spots, that was it. The fool looked all weak spot. "You may go, Sergeant." "Sir," said the sergeant, and marched out stiffly. "Fool." "Marry, sir," said the fool nervously, and gave his hated mandolin a quick strum. The Duke sat down on the throne. "I am already extremely married," he said. "Advise me, my fool." "I'faith, nuncle," said the fool. "Nor am I thy nuncle. I feel sure I would have remembered," said Lord Felmet, leaning down until the prow of his nose was a few inches from the fool's stricken face. "If you preface your next remark with nuncle, i'faith, or marry, it will go hard with you." The fool moved his lips silently and then said, "How do you feel about prithee?" The Duke knew when to allow some slack. "Prithee I can live with," he said. "So can you, but no capering." He grinned encouragingly. "How long have you been a fool, boy?" "Prithee, sirrah—" "The sirrah," said the Duke, holding up a hand. "On the whole, I think not." "Prithee, sirrah, sir," said the fool, and swallowed nervously. "All my life, sir. 17 years under the bladder, man and boy. And my father before me, and my nuncle at the same time as him, and my grandad before them, and his—" "Your whole family have been fools?" "Family tradition, sir," said the fool. "Prithee, I mean—" The Duke smiled again, and the fool was too worried to notice how many teeth it contained. "You come from these parts, don't you?" said the Duke. "Ah, yes, sir. So you would know all about the native beliefs and so on?" "I suppose so, sir. Prithee." "Good. Where do you sleep, my fool?" "In the stables, sir." "From now on you may sleep in the corridor outside my room," said the Duke beneficently. "Gosh!" "And now," said the Duke, his voice dripping across the fool like treacle over a pudding, "tell me about witches." That night, the fool slept on good royal flagstones in the whistling corridor above the great hall, instead of the warm, stuffy straw of the stables. "This is foolish," he told himself. "Marry, but is it foolish enough?" He dozed off fitfully, into some sort of dream where a vague figure kept trying to attract his attention, and was only dimly aware of the voices of Lord and Lady Felmet on the other side of the door. "It's certainly a lot less draughty," said the Duchess grudgingly. The Duke sat back in the armchair and smiled at his wife. "Well," she demanded, "where are the witches?" "The Chamberlain would appear to be right, beloved. The witches seem to have the local people in thrall. The sergeant of the guard came back empty-handed." Handed. He came down heavily on the importunate thought. "You must have him executed," she said promptly, "to make an example to others." "A course of action, my dear, which ultimately results in us ordering the last soldier to cut his own throat as an example to himself. By the way," he added mildly, "there would appear to be somewhat fewer servants around the place. You know I would not normally interfere." "Then don't," she snapped. "Housekeeping is under my control." I cannot abide slackness. I'm sure you know best, but what of these witches? Will you stand idly by and let trouble seed for the future? Will you let these witches defy you? What of the crown? The Duke shrugged. No doubt it ended in the river, he said. And the child? He was given to the witches. Do they do human sacrifice? It would appear not, said the Duke. The Duchess looked vaguely disappointed. These witches, said the Duke. Apparently they seem to cast a spell on people. Well, obviously. Not like a magic spell. They seem to be respected. They do medicine and so on. It's rather strange. The mountain people seem to be afraid of them and proud of them at the same time. It might be a little difficult to move against them. I could come to believe, said the Duchess darkly, that they have cast a glamour over you as well. In fact, the Duke was intrigued. Power was always darkly fascinating, which was why he had married the Duchess in the first place. He stared fixedly at the fire. In fact, said the Duchess, who recognized the malign smile, you like it, don't you? The thought of the danger. I remember when we were married, all that business with the knotted rope. She snapped her fingers in front of the Duke's glazed eyes. He sat up. Not at all, he shouted. Then what will you do? Wait. Wait? Wait and consider. Patience is a virtue. The Duke sat back. The smile he smiled could have spent 1,000,000 years sitting on a rock. And then, just below one eye, he started to twitch. Blood was oozing between the bandages on his hand. Once again the full moon rode the clouds. Granny Weatherwax milked and fed the goats, banked the fire, put a cloth over the mirror and pulled her broomstick out from behind the door. She went out, locked the back door behind her, and hung the key on its nail in the privy. This was quite sufficient. Only once in the entire history of witchery in the Ramtops had a thief broken into a witch's cottage. The witch concerned visited the most terrible punishment on him.
She did nothing, although sometimes when she saw him in the village, she'd smile in a faint, puzzled way. After 3 weeks of this, the suspense was too much for him, and he took his own life. In fact, he took it all the way across the continent, where he became a reformed character and never went home again.
Granny sat on the broom and muttered a few words, but without much conviction. After a further couple of tries, she got off, fiddled with the binding, and had another go. There was a suspicion of glitter from one end of the stick, which quickly died away. Drat, she said under her breath. She looked around carefully in case anyone was watching. In fact, it was only a hunting badger who, hearing the thumping of running feet, poked its head out from the bushes and saw Granny hurtling down the path with her broomstick held stiff-armed beside her. At last the magic caught, and she managed to vault clumsily onto it before it trundled into the night sky as gracefully as a duck with one wing missing. From above the trees came a muffled curse against all dwarfish mechanics. Most witches preferred to live in isolated cottages with the traditional curly chimneys and weed-grown thatch. Granny Weatherwax approved of this. It was no good being a witch unless you let people know. Nanny Ogg didn't care much about what people knew, and even less for what they thought, and lived in a new, knick-knack-crammed cottage in the middle of Lanka town itself, and at the heart of her own private empire. Various daughters and daughters-in-law came in to cook and clean on a sort of rota. Every flat surface was stuffed with ornaments brought back by far-travelling members of the family. Sons and grandsons kept the log pile stacked, the roof shingled, the chimney swept. The drinks cupboard was always full, the pouch by her rocking chair always stuffed with tobacco. Above the hearth was a huge poker-work sign saying, Mother. No tyrant in the whole history of the world had ever achieved a domination so complete. Nanny Og also kept a cat, a huge one-eyed grey tom called Grebo, who divided his time between sleeping, eating, and fathering the most enormous incestuous feline tribe. He opened his eye like a yellow window into hell when he heard Granny's broomstick land awkwardly on the back lawn. With the instinct of his kind, he recognised Granny as an inveterate cat-hater and oozed gently under a chair. Margaret was already seated primly by the fire. It is one of the few unbendable rules of magic that its practitioners cannot change their own appearance for any length of time. Their bodies develop a kind of morphic inertia and gradually return to their original shape. But Margaret tried. Every morning her hair was long, thick and blonde, but by the evening it had always returned to its normal worried frizz. To ameliorate the effect, she had tried to plait violets and cowslips in it. The result was not all she had hoped. It gave the impression that a window box had fallen on her head. "Good evening," said Granny.
"Well met by moonlight," said Margaret politely. "Merry meet as star shines on."
"Watcha?" said Nanny Og. Margaret winced. Granny sat down and started moving the pins that nailed her tall hat to her bun. Finally, the sight of Margaret dawned on her. "Margaret!" The young witch jumped and clamped her knuckly hands to the virtuous frontage of her gown.
"Yes?"
she quavered. "What have you got on your lap?"
"It's my familiar,"
she said defensively. "What happened to that toad you had?"
"It wandered off," muttered Margaret. "Anyway, it wasn't very good."
Granny sighed. Margaret's desperate search for a reliable familiar had been going on for some time, and despite the love and attention she lavished on them, they all seemed to have some terrible flaw, such as a tendency to bite, get trodden on, or, in extreme cases, metamorphose. "That makes 15 this year," said Granny, "not counting the horse. What's this one?"
"It's a rock,"
chuckled Nanny Og. "Well, at least it should last," said Granny. The rock extended ahead and gave her a look of mild amusement.
"It's a tortoise," said Margaret. "I bought it down in Sheepridge Market. It's incredibly old and knows many secrets, the man said."
"I know that man," said Granny. "He's the one who sells goldfish that tarnish after a day or two."
"Anyway, I shall call him Lightfoot," said Margaret, her voice warm with defiance. "I can if I want."
Yes, all right, I'm sure," said Granny. "Anyway, how goes it, sisters? It is 2 months since last we met."
"It should be every new moon," said Margaret sternly. "Regular."
"It was our Graham's youngest's wedding," said Nanny Og. "Couldn't miss it." "And I was up all night with the sick goat," said Granny Weatherwax promptly. "Yes, well," said Margaret doubtfully. She rummaged in her bag.
"Anyway, if we're going to start, we better light the candles."
The senior witches exchanged a resigned glance.
"But we've got this lovely new lamp our Tracy sent me," said Nanny Og innocently, "and I was going to poke at the fire a bit."
"I have excellent night vision, Margaret," said Granny sternly, "and you've been reading them funny books. Grimmers."
"Grimoires."
"You ain't going to draw on the floor again neither," warned Nanny Og. "It took our dream days to clean up all those what's names last time."
"Runes,"
said Margaret. There was a look of pleading in her eyes.
"Look, just one candle."
"All right," said Nanny Og, relenting a bit. "If it makes you feel any better, just the one, mind. And a decent white one, nothing fancy." Margaret sighed. It probably wasn't a good idea to bring out the rest of the contents of her bag.
"We ought to get a few more here," she said sadly. "It's not right, a coven of 3.
"I didn't know we were still a coven. No one told me we were still a coven," sniffed Granny Weatherwax. "Anyway, there's no one else this side of the mountain excepting old Grandma Dismas, and she doesn't get out these days."
But a lot of young girls in my village, said Margaret. You know, they could be keen.
That's not how we do it, as well you know, said Granny disapprovingly. People don't go and find witchcraft, it comes and finds them.
Yes, said Margaret. Sorry.
Right, said Granny, slightly mollified. She'd never mastered the talent for apologising, but she appreciated it in other people. What about this new duke, then? Said Nanny to lighten the atmosphere. Granny sat back. He had some houses burned down in Badass, she said, because of taxes.
How horrible, said Margaret.
Old King Verence used to do that, said Nanny. Terrible temper he had. He used to let people get out first, though, said Granny. Oh, yes, said Nanny, who was a staunch royalist. He could be very gracious like that. He'd pay for them to be rebuilt as often as not, if he remembered. And every Hogswatch night a side of venison, regular, said Granny wistfully. Oh, yes, very respectful to witches he was, added Nanny Og. When he was out hunting people, if he met me in the woods, it was always off with his helmet, and I hope I find you well, Mistress Og, and next day he'd send his butler down with a couple of bottles of something. He was a proper king.
Hunting people isn't really right, though, said Margaret.
Well, no, Granny Weatherwax conceded. But it was only if they'd done something bad. He said they enjoyed it, really, and he used to let them go if they gave him a good run.
And then there was that great hairy thing of his, said Nanny Og.
There was a perceptible change in the atmosphere. It became warmer, darker, filled at the corners with the shadows of unspoken conspiracy. Ah, said Granny Weatherwax distantly. His droit to Segner.
Needed a lot of exercise,
said Nanny Og, staring at the fire.
But next day he'd send his housekeeper round with a bag of silver and a hamper of stuff for the wedding, said Granny.
Many a couple got a proper start in life thanks to that.
Ah,
agreed Nanny.
1 or 2 individuals, too.
Every inch a king, said Granny.
What are you talking about? Said Margaret suspiciously. Did he keep pets?
The 2 witches surfaced from whatever deeper current they had been swimming in. Granny Weatherwax shrugged.
I must say, Margaret went on in severe tones, if you think so much of the old king, you don't seem very worried about him being killed. I mean, it was a pretty suspicious accident.
And that's kings for you, said Granny. They come and go, good and bad. His father poisoned the king we had before.
That was old Thorgrim, said Nanny Og. Had a big red beard, I recall. He was very gracious too, you know.
Only now no one must say Felmick killed the king, said Margaret. What? Said Granny.
He had some people executed in Lanka the other day for saying it, Margaret went on. Spreading malicious lies, he said. He said anyone saying different will see the inside of his dungeons, only not for long. He said Verence died of natural causes.
Well, being assassinated is natural causes for a king, said Granny. I don't see why he's so sheepish about it. When old Thargan was killed, they stuck his head on a pole, had a big bonfire, and everyone in the palace got drunk for a week.
I remember, said Nanny. They carried his head all round the villages to show he was dead. Very convincing, I thought, especially for him. He was grinning. I think it was the way he would have liked to go.
I think we might have to keep an eye on this one, though, said Granny. I think he might be a bit clever. That's not a good thing in a king, and I don't think he knows how to show respect.
A man came to see me last week to ask if I wanted to pay any taxes, said Margaret. I told him no.
He came to see me too, said Nanny Og.
But our Jason and our Wayne went out and told him we didn't want to join.
Small man, bald, black cloak, said Granny thoughtfully.
Yes,
said the other 2. He was hanging about in my raspberry bushes, said Granny. Only when I went out to see what he wanted, he ran away.
Actually, I gave him twopence, said Margaret. He said he was going to be tortured, you see, if he didn't get witches to pay their taxes.